The Elves and the Shoemaker. There was once a shoemaker who was very poor, although he was a master craftsman. Every day he seemed to get even poorer until he sold so few shoes that he had no money to buy leather to make new ones. At last he only had one piece of leather left. That night he cut out the leather and with a sigh left it on his workbench, ready to stitch up into his last pair of shoes in the morning. As he went upstairs to bed, he could only think that if a miracle didn't happen, he would have to sell his shop. The next morning, when he opened his workroom door, the shoemaker saw something extraordinary. On his bench stood the most beautifully made pair of shoes he'd ever seen. He darted to pick them up. He turned them over in his hands. He couldn't have made them better himself. That morning, a rich man walked past the shop. He saw the pair of shoes in the window and liked them so much that he was willing to pay twice what the shoemaker asked. Now the shoemaker had enough money to buy leather for 2 more pairs of shoes. That evening, he cut them out and left them on his workbench. In the morning, to his great joy, the leather had been stitched up into 2 beautiful pairs of shoes. The shoemaker was able to sell them for enough money to buy leather for 4 pairs of shoes. For some time, things went on like this. Soon the shoemaker's little shop became so famous that rich ladies and gentlemen from all over the country came to see what he had to sell. But one day near Christmas, the shoemaker, who was a kind-hearted man, said to his wife, "Don't you think we ought to see who's doing us this favor? Think how poor we once were and how well off we are now. Tonight, let's stay downstairs with the light off and see who comes." So instead of going to bed, the shoemaker and his wife hid behind the workroom door. As quiet as mice, they waited. As midnight struck from the church tower, the shoemaker's wife nudged her husband. 2 tiny elves dressed in rags were clambering up onto the workbench. They ran around looking at what work they had to do. Then they seized the shoemaker's tools and began. As they worked, they sang, stitch thee, stitch thee shoes, for kings and queens to choose. Dart thee needle, pull thee stitch, work, 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 to make the cobbler rich. Long before dawn, they finished their work and slipped away. The shoemaker and his wife got up late next morning. Over breakfast, the wife said, "Think how cold those poor little creatures must have been. Their feet were bare and their clothes were just rags. It made me shiver just to look at them. Don't you think we ought to make them a present to say thank you for all the work they've done for us?" The shoemaker agreed, and he and his wife got to work immediately. That night they left the tiniest clothes and shoes you could imagine on the workbench. At midnight, as the church clock struck, the elves appeared again. At first they seemed puzzled to find no shoes to stitch, but suddenly they realized what kind of presents had been left for them. With whoops of joy, they pulled on the tiny clothes and shoes. Then they began to dance all around the room, leaping on and off the table, balancing along the backs of the chairs, and swinging on the curtains. As they played, they sang, "The shoemaker has no more need of elves, now let him stock his own shelves." With that, they ran out the door and across the churchyard. They never came back. The shoemaker was sad to see them go, but he could hardly complain after all the work they'd done for him, and they seemed to leave a little of their magic behind them, for he and his wife were lucky for the rest of their lives.